We're starting a new sermon series called Revive. Revive. Revive means and implies bringing something back to life or bringing something back to fully living. It was about 8 years or 11 years ago, as I understand the history of the church, that Trinity started to lose its life and purpose. And again, as I understand it, over those 11 years, the church had gone from kind of serving others to survival mode. And like tens of thousands of churches around the United States, the questions and challenges were not primarily focused on others, but on ourselves. It wasn't so much what's going on outside the door as the focus was just keeping the doors opened. And hence, we need to be revived. And I think we're in the process of that. The word revive means bring life again. So this is not a new thing. The church around the world for 2,000 years, the epicenter of the church has moved. A quick history. Christianity's center started in the Middle East, in Israel. It died. It moved on to Turkey and northern Africa and Europe, and then it died, not completely out, but died. Then to South and Latin America, then to the U.S., which is currently dying in the U.S., and now the shift is to southern part of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. So the church is always kind of dying, going through ups and downs, because Christians, spiritually speaking, are going through ups and downs. But as we saw last week, Jesus said, "And I will build my church, and the powers of death, or the powers that seek to destroy it, will not prevail." So what might seem like a gloomy picture isn't actually filled with hope when you take a step back. But we certainly want to be a part of a church and a country that's being revived spiritually. And so that's what this sermon series is about. It's not just about the church, it's really about you and me. Because we are the church. The church isn't a building. And as you and I are revived in our faith, so too will the church be revived in our faith. So in this process, we're being guided by a unit or a division of the Presbyterian Church called Vital Congregations. This sermon series kind of is springboards off 7 marks of vital congregations. Let me just go over those with you. The 7 marks are going to sound really Presbyterian, so I'll kind of I'll decode them for you. So the first mark is lifelong discipleship formation. It really means to grow, to be growing in your relationship with Jesus, and you're acting more and more like Jesus. Lifelong discipleship formation. The second is intentional, authentic evangelism. It's really means to learn how to share your faith in the way that God made you, and the gifts that you have and the opportunities you have. The third is outward incarnational focus, which means thinking about others as well as ourselves, as I would say, being a hub and not just a little insular club. The fourth is empower servant leadership, which is helping you discover your gifts and getting you plugged into ministry so that it helps other people and helps you in the process. The fifth is Spirit-inspired worship, and that's what we do in this room. That gathered worship needs to inspire you to think, to feel, and to do, and me as well. 6 is caring relationships, which that one's pretty easy. It's caring relationships. And the last one is ecclesiastical health. Say that 5 times, not out loud. That just means that we have the right systems in place to function correctly. So again, as a congregation, we're going to be thinking about these, but it's not just about the church, it's about you. And these are kind of like vital systems that you and I have in our lives to be renewed, to be revived, to be a healthy and growing follower of Jesus. And so I have 3 asks. One is that you do all you can to attend on Sunday morning. Check for today. Good job. If you're not here, I'll send you a link if I have your email so you can review the sermon, but really encourage you to come on Sunday morning. Secondly, attend a Bible study on Sunday morning or Wednesday night for the next 8 weeks. And number 3, in your program, there's 2 individual Bible studies that tie in with the theme of the sermon. I ask you to do those on your own during the week. Okay, so this morning we want to think together about lifelong discipleship formation. Okay, what is that? Lifelong discipleship formation. Lifelong, it means that our faith is a journey. It means we never arrive. It means there's an ebb and flow to our faith. There's ups and downs. It means that we develop practices, relationships, and experiences and follow them to the best of our ability throughout our life. It's lifelong. It's a journey, not a destination. Discipleship, lifelong discipleship. A disciple is a learner. That's what a disciple is. It's a learner. And in academia, they want us to become lifelong learners. And as in academia, so in Trinity, in the church. You don't arrive, it's a journey, but a disciple is a learner. And it's learning to think like Jesus thought so that we live like Jesus lived. Lifelong discipleship formation is a great biblical word. It means to change. It means to morph. In fact, the biblical word for formed is metamorpho, from which we get the word metamorphosis. And it images a change. And you and I are to be changing, to be growing, to being formed into the image of Jesus. The Apostle Paul wrote this to the Christians in Galatia a long time ago. He said, I ache as in the pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. As someone who planted this church and who pastored this church, he looked out in his congregation and he ached. He ached until people were growing and maturing more and more, and we're going to come back to that this morning. So lifelong discipleship formation, that's what we're going to think about this morning. Becoming more and more like Jesus. Having Jesus being formed in us more and more. A little girl and her mom just went to church for the first time. Mom turned to the little girl and said, hey, what do you think about church? And she said, I always like when they say actually, like I didn't expect to, but I actually thought it was pretty good. But I have some questions. I'm confused. Why, honey? Well, the pastor said that God is really big. Is God really big? I mean, really big? Bigger than us? Oh, honey, yes, God is big. He's got the whole world in his hands. God is really, really big. Okay, but the pastor also said that God lives inside of us. Does God live inside of us? Well, yes, honey. God the Holy Spirit lives inside of us. And it's hard to explain or understand, but it's true. God the Holy Spirit lives inside of us. Okay, well, that's what I thought. But, Mommy, if God is really, really, really big and God lives inside of us, shouldn't more of God show through us? And I heard that years ago, and I said, okay, that's cute. But it's a good question, isn't it? Shouldn't God show through us more and more? Do you ever ask that of yourselves? You kind of look back at your week or look at an interaction that you just had and said, gosh, how long have I been a follower of Jesus and I'm still acting like an infant spiritually? Or maybe it's easier to look at someone else. Say, you know what? Where is Jesus in there? Right? Formed. It's God's desire that you and I be formed so that more and more of Jesus, God will show through us. This is God's yearning. This is God's hope. This is God's expectation. This is God's generous offer that you can change. This is God's generous offer that you can change. Perfection? No. Close? Probably not. More? Yes. Yes. not only is it God's desire that you and I be transformed or formed, but He equips us with all the resources. He gives us, as a gift, all the resources by which we can be formed. Peter wrote these amazing, powerful words. He says this, and I've shared this with you before, and I'm sure I will again. Peter writes, His divine power, God's divine power, has given gift. You don't earn it. It's a gift. His divine power has given us everything we need for life and godliness. Life. He has given us His very great and precious promises. He has given us His very great and precious, so that through them, watch this, you may participate in the divine nature. You may. He's given us all the resources we need so that you and I may participate in the divine nature. We may participate more and more in the divine nature, which was the nature of Jesus. Well, 2,000 years ago, in a region called Galatia, which is in Greece, the Apostle Paul started a church, and it was started, and people were coming together, but they weren't growing in their faith. They were being conformed to the patterns around them rather than being transformed into the image of Jesus. And it was so frustrating for the Apostle Paul. So he wrote them a letter, and we call the letter Galatians. And the main purpose of the letter was to help them to be transformed, to be formed. And that's what we're going to look at. And so he says this. He said, and we're going to kind of jump into the end of the letter in chapter 5. He says, the fruit of the Spirit, or what we want to show through more and more, the fruit of the Spirit, or what our life will look like more and more when we are being formed, is this, Paul writes. The fruit of the Spirit is love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. This is the divine nature. The Apostle Paul calls it the fruit of the Spirit, using a different metaphor, but it's the life of Jesus, loving, patient, kind, joyful, good, faithful, self-controlled. This is what God equips us with so that we can move in that direction more and more. But we struggle, don't we? In fact, what we want to show through often is not this list, but the previous list. A quick review of our week or maybe our year will find these characteristics: sexual immorality, impurity, hatred, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, envy, drunkenness, and then I like what he says, and the like. Stuff like that. You know what I'm talking about, Paul says. And so there's this conflict. In fact, following this verse, the Apostle Paul writes these words. Yes, good. For the sinful nature desires what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the sinful nature. They're in conflict. Do you feel that conflict? Do you feel that conflict within you? Sometimes in cartoons they show a little, guy with a halo on this shoulder and the little guy with the devil on. I mean, okay, that's kind of cute, but that's what the Apostle Paul was writing. There's a conflict within each and every human being. Call it what you will, the Apostle Paul. It's the sinful nature and the spiritual nature. If you're a follower of Jesus, there's this conflict. And another letter of the Romans, Paul writes, the things I want to do, doggone it, I just don't do those things. And the things I don't want to do, I keep on doing. Conflict. And then he says, oh, what a wretched person I am, the Apostle Paul says. Why? Because he feels that conflict. I want to do this, but I can't do this all the time. And I don't want to do this, and I just kind of think that way, and I do these things. Oh, conflict. And so there is a conflict between the sinful nature and the spiritual nature. And yet, even though our sinful tendencies will remain in us till our dying day, they do not have to dominate over us. Well, how? How can God show through us more and more? How can the fruit of the Spirit? How can we participate in the divine nature? Consider two ways this morning The first is what I'm going to call grit, determination, discipline. I will be more loving. I will be more kind. I will. And you've probably heard me use this example because I just think it's very profound. When I think of grit, when I think of a person of discipline and tenacity and never giving up, I think of Benjamin Franklin. If you've ever read through his autobiography, there was no quit in him. You know, he was the guy that said something like after a failure, he says, I haven't failed, and I don't remember the exact number, I haven't failed 10,000 times. I've only found 10,000 times that this solution didn't work. Okay? He has grit. And Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, said at one point in his life, he wanted to reach moral perfection. And so he came up with 13 virtues, and maybe you can't read those, but temperance, silence, industry, justice, humility, 13 virtues, and he was going to focus on one virtue per week and have 4 cycles of that for 52. 13 times 4 is 52, right? Right, okay. So he would focus on, let's say, silence for 1 week, and then he kept a little notebook. And when he messed up in that virtue, he would check. And he was really encouraged because at the end of the week, there were less and less check marks. So he felt he was getting better. At the end of the year, he looked back on his notebook, and here's what he writes. He writes, I was surprised to find myself, next slide. I was surprised to find myself so much fuller of faults than I had imagined. He says, I never arrived at the perfection I had been so ambitious of obtaining, but fell far short of it. And so talking about ridding himself of pride, he says this. Can you find that slide? It starts with disguised. Yeah, there you go. This is what he says about pride. Disguise it, struggle with it, beat it down, stifle it, mortify it as much as one pleases. It's still alive. And then these words, for even if I could conceive that I had completely overcome my pride, I would then probably be proud of my humility. Can you sense his struggle? All right, and it's all of our struggle. There's a struggle going on, his frustration. So that's grit. Well, if it's not by grit, maybe it's just by God's grace. Maybe it's just by God's grace. Maybe we just let go and let God. That sounds spiritual. Maybe we just trust in the Lord that His grace will change and transform us. That sounds really spiritual. Amen. However, I have found that when we just let go and let God, we just let go. I found that being passive in our transformation and change does not work. Well, if it's not by grit and not by grace, what is it? This passage in Galatians 5 implies that both are absolutely critical. It's our grit and God's grace working together. So let's think about that. First and foremost, our passage in Galatians 5 teaches that this fruit of the Spirit is God's grace. It's first and foremost God's grace. It's supernatural in its origin. It's called the fruit of the Spirit. It's spiritual fruit. It's supernatural in its origin. It's only God's grace and God's grace alone that can change your heart. It's only God's grace and God's grace alone that can change and transform us. When King David committed his sin of adultery and then murder, he cried out, "Create in me a clean heart, O God." Because he knew that only God, only the grace of God and the power of the Holy Spirit can change and transform our human hearts. But, or however, or and, God's Spirit must work with us in creation. We are co-workers with God's grace. The Apostle Paul writes this, since we live by the Spirit, that's God's grace, we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. That's your part, that's my part. That's our grit. First part is grace. Since we live by the Spirit, we live and move and have our being in our life in Jesus because of His grace that He offers us, doesn't force it, He offers it to you and to me. And then Paul says, let us keep in step with the Spirit. The Spirit will guide you. The Spirit will speak to you. The Spirit moves ahead of us, and we're to keep in step, using another metaphor, with the Spirit. That is our grit. The fruit of the Spirit is supernatural in its origin. It's the fruit of the Spirit, but it's natural in its growth. It's called the fruit of the Spirit. And I like both in these passages because it really highlights what I'm wanting to say. It's God's grace and our grit. It's God's grace and Spirit, but it's fruit. And fruit, just like apples and oranges and grapefruit and limes, love limes, the fruit of the Spirit needs to be watered. It needs to be fertilized. It needs to be, get the weeds out. It needs to be tended. And it's our responsibility in the spiritual life to water and fertilize this fruit within us. Let me give you an illustration. Think of gardening. Think of lemons. Lemons, you plant a small tree, they start to grow, you plant them, and you water them, but they grow by God's grace. You don't cause them to grow. You could put marbles in the ground and water it and fertilize it and weed it and all those things, and the marbles aren't going to grow. Why? Because it's not in the nature of a marble to grow. It's in the nature of seeds to grow. Why? Because of God's grace. God implanted that in them. He gives the seed freely, if you will. Now, if you forget to water your lemon tree, God's grace is still active, but here's what you get. Here's my lemon tree when I didn't water it. What do you get? You get no lemons. Looks good on the outside, but I forgot to fertilize it and water it. I'm told you got to water them a lot. Why? Because God's grace and no grit equals no lemons. God's grace plus no grit equals no lemons. How many of you know that from experience? Okay, I do. But here's the thing. If you water them, here's what you get. Okay, now this just went through the storms from the last month. But I got 15 lemons this year. About 20 dropped off and rotted away. But why is that? God's grace was in both the plants, but my grit produced some lemons. And the same is true in your spiritual life, in our spiritual life. God's planted the seeds within us, but when we fail to water with the Word, when we fail to fertilize it with prayer, you know, we get lives that don't show through more and more. We get lives that aren't being transformed. We get lives that are conformed to the patterns around us more and more. And this spiritual struggle we lose over and over and over and over again. So, how do we water our spiritual hearts? We water and fertilize it through what's been called the spiritual habits or spiritual discipline. Discipline. How do you feel about the word discipline? I don't like the word discipline. Years ago, there was a great book called Celebration of Discipline. I encourage you to get the book. It's a life book. And I remember looking at the title, Celebration of Discipline. Seemed like a conflict, seemed like an oxymoron. How do you celebrate discipline? Discipline is something that's done to you that's yucky, that you don't like. It's a harsh word, celebration of discipline. It seems like it puts you in a prison. But discipline sets you free. Discipline actually sets you free to keep in step with the Spirit. The way that we keep in step with the Spirit, the way that we put ourselves in the place where God's Spirit can change and transform us is through habits. Think about sports. I love sports. I love participating in sports, watching sports, Olympics, skating, track and field, basketball, all that stuff. And don't they make it look easy? I remember as a kid and we watched the Olympic and skating, and it just looks so easy. You know, they're just out there twirling around, and then you get on the ice and it's, right? Say, wait a minute, this looks so easy. Why did it look so easy? Because they practiced for 100,000 hours. They practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced and practiced. So when they got out on the field to play, it freed them up. It freed them up. But when you and I go out and try and hit a golf ball 250 yards straight, or try and return a serve that's 110 miles an hour, or try and shoot a basketball from the three-point range, it's really hard. We can't do it. Why? Because we didn't train and train and train and train. We tried really hard. We tried really hard. So often we try and play like our heroes do without practicing. And we fall short and we get frustrated. Same is true in the spiritual life. We try so hard to be loving and kind and forgiving and gracious and all the other attributes of Jesus. And we try and we try and we try and we constantly, we can't forgive as well. We can't stop saying those words. We can't stop thinking those thoughts. We can't stop hitting the button on the computer. We want to, but we try and try. But the problem is we don't train. I lived in Chicago in the 90s, and when I go out to play basketball, do you know what I saw? In the 90s, I was there when Michael Jordan was big, and they won all these championships. And I saw people lowering the hoops. They made hoops where you actually could lower them. I think they still do. And kids were out there dunking the ball with their tongues out. Why? Because that's what Michael Jordan did. You know, and they were trying to be like Jordan did on the playing field. They lower the thing and then go like this. Yesterday, we were in McKinley Park, and I saw some kids playing basketball. They weren't acting like that. You know what they were doing? Next slide. They wanted to be like Steph Curry and Klay Thompson. And they were no one was going to, they didn't lower the rim. They were shooting those 3-point, and the kid was sitting there literally like this. Why? Because that's what their heroes do. And so they try and do that, and this kid was clanking them and clanking them and clanking them. He made a few. But here's the point. We try and act like our heroes on the playing field, and then when we try and be like them, apart from their skill and being 6'8" and all that stuff, we get out there and we can't perform like that. Why? Because we haven't practiced. You get the analogy, right? And the same is true with Jesus. We try and be like Jesus so hard we try and be like him. And yet we fall short. And we feel guilty. And we feel unworthy. And then we think the Christian life is impossible. You think more and more, this is who I am because of my mom and dad, because of my first marriage or my second marriage, because of who I'm hanging out with. This is who I am. This is how I'm wired. And I cannot change. While our sinful tendencies will continue until our dying day, you can change. We can change. More and more Jesus can show through us by God's grace and our grit. So often we want to act like Jesus did in public, but we don't act like Jesus did in private. Remember the bracelet WWJD? What would Jesus do? It was real popular. People wore them on their wrists, and it was good. You know, you get in a situation and say, okay, so-and-so did they. Well, what would Jesus do? Oh, I know what Jesus would do. He would love. Okay, I'll try and love. See, what would Jesus do was good, but I didn't have a problem with what would Jesus do. That's pretty easy to figure out what would Jesus do. I just didn't know how to do what Jesus would do. Right? And so someone came up with this phrase that I like. It's not by trying harder, but by training better. It's not by trying harder. Oh, I'll be like Jesus, I'll be like Jesus, I'll be like Jesus, I'll be like Jesus. Well, how did Jesus train? In fact, Jesus said this, it was so good. He said, students are not above their teacher, but everyone means anyone, that means you and me, regardless of where we are. Everyone who's fully what? Trained. Everyone who's fully trained will be like Jesus. That's crazy. I can be more and more like Jesus? Yes. Okay, I'll try hard. No. Put your trying into training. That's good. Train harder. Train harder. Well, how did Jesus train? All you have to do is read through the Gospels and look how Jesus trained. This isn't new. He prayed all the time. He knew the Scriptures. He participated in gathered worship. He had fellowship and friends. We need each other. These are habits that we get to put into our lives so that over time we can be more and more changed, more and more transformed into the image of Jesus. Lifelong discipleship formation, Christ being formed in you. So let me give you some thoughts in closing, and again, you've heard these before. I want to think about. I'm sorry. Here's the bracelet I'm having on sale after the church. Not really. HWJT. How would Jesus train? That's what we ought to sell. Not WWJD. That's good, but I want on my other. Okay, how did Jesus train? I don't want to only know what he did because I know what he did. I just can't do what he did. I want to know what he did in private to act like he did in public more and more. So I want to think of the word pre. Pre-form means before you're formed, here's what you do. Ready? I've done these before. Pre stands for practices. And in the beginning of this new year, what are some practices? Gathered worship is one. Bible study is another. In a group after church today or on Wednesday night. Or Bible study on your own. I've given you two, but there are lots of different Bible reading study methods. That's training. Practices. What are practices? Secondly, in relationships. We need each other to grow. We need to be in a small group, and over the next year or so, we're going to start forming small groups again. There are some small groups that meet, but we all need to be in a small group. We need to have someone in our life where we can be transparent, where we can take off some of our masks and risk vulnerability with other people. Someone needs to know what's going on spiritually, emotionally, relationally in your life and my life. Practices, relationships, experiences. Going on a mission trip, serving others, being in gathered worship. So just think through that as we kind of almost done with January already. Goes fast. Here's some questions for further insight. This is another practice you can do. Hopefully with someone else this coming week. What about the teaching inspired you this morning? This isn't for now, this is later, so I can't hear. What about the teaching today didn't you understand or are not sure about? Number 2, what is one practice or relationship or experience that you will pursue to help you grow in your faith? And number 3, does the idea of training in your faith appeal to you or cause you hesitation? Does the idea of training in your faith appeal to you or go, I've never heard that before? Why do you think that this is so? So one last thing about this fruit of the Spirit metaphor. Just like fruit, it doesn't happen overnight. Just like fruit, it doesn't happen overnight. The watering and the fertilizing, and you don't do 5 Bible studies in a row and then you go, bum, 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 I'm like Jesus. No. Years and years and years and years and years, but slowly. Hopefully you see little things. You're forgiving more. You're disciplined a little bit more in your thinking and your actions. You're loving more and forgiving more. Slowly and slowly. And then you really, really mess up again. And you go, and that's why the Apostle Paul writes also in Galatians, he says, and I'm going to apply it to what I just talked about. He says, do not be weary in well-doing. For in due season, I'm going to change a little bit, you will morph if you don't give up. Don't be weary in well-doing. For in due season, you'll reap a harvest if you don't give up.